Okay, today we're going to talk about the Native American groups in North America. By the end of today, I expect you to be able to identify and describe the five major North American Indian culture and the regions they lived in. So let's begin. The story of America as we know it began when Indians and Europeans first discovered each other. However, it's believed that native inhabitants of North America migrated down from the Bering Strait from Asia into North America, migrated down before the time of Christ, long before the 1400s when Europeans finally discovered them. Now, these Native Americans, it's believed that they thought that great spirits were coming back for them. The great spirits would come and live with them, so they were waiting for this. So, whenever they saw these giant ships, they had never seen this before. So they saw them as floating islands, and they thought that the Europeans were these great spirits coming back to live with them. Now, whenever the first two groups met each other, they were both amazed in their own way. The Indians were amazed because the Europeans were pale. They had hairy faces. They would wear dark and heavy clothing. They had these shiny new trinkets, and they had new noisy weapons. The Europeans, on the flip side, were just as amazed, but they were amazed because the Native Americans were wild. They were living unlike anybody else they'd ever met. They had pagan rituals and pagan superstitions. They wore very little clothing, and they did not look like hard workers. At first, the two groups got along, but soon more Europeans arrived, and the Indians really didn't like the way the Europeans were treating them. But we'll get to that later. Let's talk about Columbus for a minute. Now, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean on this small island, San Salvador, eventually making his way to Cuba. Christopher Columbus had this great idea. He was going to sail west to get to the east. His goal was to make it to the Indies, make it to India, China, other Asian cultures, but he didn't account for this giant landmass that he would encounter, North America and South America. He mistakenly thought when he landed in San Salvador and in Cuba that he was in India. So he called these first Americans Indians. This year we're going to be talking about the North American Indian culture groups. We're going to start with the woodlands right here. Now, the woodland Indians, they're considered woodland Indians. They live anywhere along the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. This whole area, they're considered the woodland Indians. Now, these Indians, they were farmers. They lived in permanent homes. They hunted. They fished. They did not move around. They were not nomadic. Some of these tribes you might remember us talking about: the Iroquois, the Mound Builders, the tribe of five civilized tribes. Next, the Plains Indians. Now, the Plains Indians and the Plateau Indians are very similar, so I'm going to group them together. These are what you would consider your typical Indians. They lived in teepees, they hunted buffalo, and they were nomadic. Now, this is a very important word that you're going to hear all year, so please keep this in mind. Nomadic, it means to wander from place to place in search of plants and animals. They were very nomadic. Next are the Southwest Indians, right down here. Parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, that area, Southwest Indians. These Indians are considered cliff dwellers, and the reason is because they lived in adobe houses on the sides of the cliffs. So they're called cliff dwellers. They were very settled as well, and they were known for their pottery. Next is the West Coast Indians. Now, the West Coast Indians lived anywhere from the Rocky Mountains over to the Pacific Ocean, this whole area. Now, these were very permanent Indians as well. They lived in very sturdy cedar homes, and these are the Indians that are known for totem poles. It's very important whenever you're talking about Native Americans, to remember their religion. They were polytheistic. They believed in more than one God. Their primary belief were that spirits live in the objects in nature. That means that there's a god of water, there's a sun god, there's a god of the buffalo, gods in trees, all of these things in nature, and they're going to pray to these gods to have a bountiful harvest that year, or to be able to hunt lots of buffalo, or to have lots of rain. They're going to pray to these gods. And that's going to be the primary conflict between the Europeans and the Indians, because the Europeans believed that they needed to please God and God alone. And they're going to push this belief on the Indians, whereas the Indians are going to push their belief back. And this is going to be a cause of conflict between the two. Well, that's it for the Native Americans. Be sure to finish your whisk and remember that you need to identify and describe all 5 Native American groups and the region they live in.